Something about what's happening in Cleveland doesn't feel random anymore. On the surface, it looks like just another offseason, another coaching search, another round of speculation. But when you slow it down and really look at the pattern, a different story starts to form. The Cleveland Browns aren't moving loudly, they're moving deliberately, and that's what makes this moment so interesting. For months, the conversation around the Browns has been full of doubt, frustration, and straight-up negativity. Local media questioning direction, national voices acting like the franchise is stuck in neutral. And right in the middle of all that noise sits a young quarterback many people already decided was the guy. But here's the thing, organizations don't behave the way Cleveland is behaving unless they see something others are missing. The coaching search is the first real clue, the names coming back, the side of the ball they specialize in, the type of systems they're known for. None of that happens by accident. Teams don't spend weeks interviewing offensive-minded coaches unless they're thinking long-term about quarterback development. And that's where Shedeur Sanders quietly enters the conversation in a very different light. This isn't about hype, it's about alignment. Sanders didn't come into the league with a clean runway. He arrived late with limited reps and almost no margin for error. Yet despite that, the Browns didn't pivot away. They didn't rush to replace him. Instead, they started asking a different question: what if the issue wasn't the quarterback but the structure around him? That's why this moment matters. Because while the media keeps arguing about ceilings, arrogance, and narratives, the front office appears to be focused on fit, development, and continuity. And that contrast is impossible to ignore. Something is being built quietly without press conferences or bold declarations. And once you notice that shift, it becomes hard to unsee it. Because the real story here isn't about what the Browns are saying, it's about what their actions are starting to reveal. And what comes next could change how this entire situation is viewed going forward. The first real signal didn't come from a press conference or a leaked quote, it came from a list. When the Cleveland Browns narrowed their head coaching search, people expected a mixed bag, maybe a defensive mind, maybe a culture builder, maybe a familiar, safe option. Instead, the names that kept resurfacing leaned heavily in one direction: offense, quarterback development, scheme. That immediately raised eyebrows. Teams don't tip their hand this early unless they're trying to solve a very specific problem. And Cleveland's problem hasn't been effort or talent on defense. It's been consistency, identity, and growth on offense, especially at quarterback. When most of your serious candidates come from offensive backgrounds, it sends a message without ever saying it out loud. Look closer at the types of coaches being discussed. System designers, play callers, quarterback-friendly minds, not just leaders of men but teachers of the position. That matters, because if the Browns were preparing to move on from their young quarterback, this search would look very different. You'd expect balance, you'd expect contingency. Instead, you're seeing alignment. This is where Shedeur Sanders starts to factor in, whether critics like it or not. Sanders didn't come into the league with the luxury of a clean runway, limited reps, no full training camp with the starters, late game appearances instead of structured development. And yet, Cleveland's response hasn't been panic, it's been planning. Reports claim the front office, led by Andrew Berry, is prioritizing fit over flash. That doesn't mean they're ignoring leadership or culture. It means they're acknowledging something many teams refuse to admit: quarterbacks don't develop in chaos. They develop in systems built to support them. And the coaching list reflects that understanding. Even the presence of defensive continuity in the discussion, with figures like Jim Schwartz, points to balance rather than replacement. Keep what's working, fix what is. That's not the approach of a franchise starting over. That's the approach of a franchise trying to unlock what it already has. And that's why this list mattered so much. It wasn't about any single name, it was about the pattern. The Browns weren't shopping for a reset button, they were shopping for a connector, someone who could stabilize the offense and finally give their quarterback a real foundation. Once you see that, the conversation changes, because this coaching search doesn't look like uncertainty, it looks like intent, and intent tells you far more than any headline ever could. This is where the conversation shifts from curiosity to logic. Because when you look at why the Browns are leaning toward offensive-minded leadership, it lines up almost perfectly with where Shedeur Sanders is in his development. Quarterbacks don't fail in isolation. They fail when timing, trust, and structure never fully come together. And that's been the quiet issue in Cleveland for a while. Sanders entered the league without the usual advantages. No full offseason built around him. No first-team training camp reps to grow into mistakes. No offensive system designed specifically to accentuate what he does best. Instead, he was dropped into fragments, late-game snaps, limited packages, and expectations that never matched opportunity. That's not a knock on his ability. That's context most people conveniently ignore. This is why offensive-minded coaches matter so much right now, not just because they call plays, but because they shape development. A quarterback-friendly coach simplifies reads early, builds confidence through rhythm throws, and gradually expands responsibility instead of forcing everything at once. That approach doesn't just help young quarterbacks survive, it allows them to grow without panic. For the Cleveland Browns, this isn't about chasing the next flashy hire, it's about fixing what's been missing. For years, Cleveland's offense has felt reactive, adjusting week to week, plugging holes instead of building continuity. That environment is brutal for any young quarterback, especially one still earning league-wide trust. Reports suggest the Browns are prioritizing coaches who understand timing-based offenses, spacing concepts, and quick decision systems. That's not accidental. Sanders' strengths have always been accuracy, composure, and processing, not backyard chaos. He doesn't need a system that asks him to play superhero. He needs one that lets him play efficient football, stack reps, and build momentum. This is also where comparisons to other young quarterbacks start to make sense. Around the league, the pattern is clear. When teams pair developing quarterbacks with the right offensive minds, production follows. When they don't, confidence erodes fast. Sanders is at that crossroads now. Another year of instability would stall progress. Alignment could accelerate it. And that's why this coaching search feels different. The Browns aren't just filling a vacancy. They're choosing an environment, one that either confirms Sanders as a long-term answer or sets him back before he ever gets a real chance. That's the weight of this decision, and it explains why offensive minds aren't just preferred, they're essential. The comparison that keeps resurfacing isn't random and it isn't forced. When people bring up Caleb Williams, they're not saying his situation is identical to Shedeur Sanders. They're pointing to a pattern the league keeps repeating and how quickly narratives can flip when the environment finally makes sense. Williams' first year in Chicago was rough, not just statistically but narratively. Every mistake felt amplified. Local media questioned his toughness. National voices floated the word bust far earlier than they should have. Fans grew impatient. There were stretches where it felt like no one wanted to admit how unstable the situation around him actually was. Coaching turnover, inconsistent play calling, and an offense that never truly settled made every Sunday feel like a survival test. At one point, the noise got so loud that people openly wondered whether the Chicago Bears had already gotten it wrong. That's how fast the league turns on young quarterbacks when structure isn't there. Talent doesn't disappear, but confidence can erode quickly when the system keeps changing underneath you. Then came the shift. Chicago stopped guessing. They committed to an offensive-minded direction, brought in a coach who understood how to build around Williams' strengths and simplified the game instead of expanding it too fast. The results weren't instant, but they were undeniable. The same quarterback who was being written off suddenly looked composed, decisive, in control, and just like that, the narrative reversed. That's why this comparison matters for Cleveland, not because Sanders and Williams play the same way, but because the lesson is universal. Quarterbacks don't magically figure it out once they hit the NFL. They need alignment, they need patience, and most importantly, they need coaches who understand development instead of rushing to judgment. What's interesting is how quickly people forget this. Williams didn't suddenly become more talented. The environment finally stopped working against him, and once that happened, the confidence followed, production followed, wins followed. That's the warning and the opportunity for the Cleveland Browns. If you've already seen how fragile early narratives can be, why repeat the same mistakes? Sanders is still early in his story. Labeling him before giving him proper structure would be the easy move. Learning from Chicago would be the smart one. Because if the Browns get this right, the same voices questioning Sanders now could be rewriting their takes faster than anyone expects. And history suggests that kind of turnaround happens quicker than people are comfortable admitting. If anyone still doubts how much coaching and structure matter for young quarterbacks, Bryce Young already provided the blueprint. His situation didn't just mirror early criticism, it exposed how quickly the league misreads development when patience disappears. One season was all it took for narratives to spiral, even though the environment around him was doing him no favors. When Young entered the league with the Carolina Panthers, expectations were sky-high. Top pick, franchise hopes, immediate results demanded, but instead of a stable offensive identity, he walked into chaos. Inconsistent protection, rotating play callers, limited weapons. Every snap felt like survival instead of growth. And predictably, the noise followed fast. Critics questioned his size, his confidence, his ceiling. Some even whispered that Carolina may have already made a mistake. At one point, the situation deteriorated enough that Young was benched. For many quarterbacks, that moment becomes the end of the story. Confidence fractures, Media labels harden, fans move on. But this is where the pattern breaks because the Panthers finally changed the environment, not the quarterback. Once Carolina committed to the right coaching direction, everything slowed down. Reads became clearer. Play design became intentional. The offense stopped asking Young to be perfect and started letting him be efficient. And almost immediately the difference showed. His decision-making improved. His composure returned. The same quarterback who looked overwhelmed suddenly looked in control. That turnaround didn't come from a talent upgrade. Young didn't suddenly gain size or arm strength. What changed was trust. Trust in the system, trust in timing, trust that mistakes wouldn't reset the entire plan, and once that trust existed, performance followed. This is why the comparison matters so much for Cleveland. Shedeur Sanders hasn't been given anything close to that level of stability yet. Limited reps, late-game exposure, constant external pressure. And still, the expectation has been immediate judgment. Bryce Young proved how flawed that approach is. The lesson is simple, but teams keep ignoring it. Young quarterbacks aren't broken, they're rushed. They're evaluated before the structure around them settles. Carolina corrected course and the results spoke for themselves. For the Cleveland Browns, that lesson is sitting right in front of them. If you build the right environment, the quarterback doesn't need saving. He needs time. Bryce Young already showed what happens when a team finally understands that, and that's why this pattern can't be dismissed anymore. It's been proven. This is where the disconnect becomes impossible to ignore, because while the Cleveland Browns appear to be moving with intention, much of the media conversation feels stuck in a completely different reality. Instead of tracking development or organizational signals, coverage has leaned heavily on tone, perception, and narrative shortcuts, and that gap has shaped how Shedeur Sanders is talked about more than how he's actually performed. A lot of it comes down to labeling. Confidence gets reframed as arrogance, poise gets dismissed as entitlement, and leadership is questioned before it's even allowed to breathe. These aren't new patterns, especially for quarterbacks who don't fit the league's preferred personality mold. Sanders' self-belief, his comfort in the spotlight, and his refusal to downplay who he is have all been used against him rather than evaluated neutrally. Meanwhile, the standards seem to shift depending on who's being discussed. When other young quarterbacks struggle, the conversation centers on protection, coaching, or system fit. When Sanders faces similar challenges, the focus jumps straight to character critiques and speculative concerns. Fans have noticed this inconsistency, and it's fueled a growing frustration with how the story is being framed. Local media hasn't helped much either. Cleveland has one of the most demanding sports environments in the league, and that pressure often turns inward. Instead of rallying around development, some outlets appear quicker to tear it down. There's been a noticeable eagerness to assume failure rather than question whether the conditions were ever fair to begin with. And once that tone sets in, it becomes self-reinforcing. This is where speculation starts creeping in. Some fans believe Sanders' confidence reminds people too much of players who challenged traditional hierarchies before. Others argue his last name adds an extra layer of discomfort for evaluators who prefer quieter storylines. None of that is proven, but the buzz exists, and it exists for a reason. Because the coverage doesn't always line up with what's happening on the field or inside the building. What makes this moment different is that the Browns' actions are starting to contradict the noise. Coaching interviews, developmental priorities, organizational patience. Those are signals that don't match the idea of a quarterback being written off internally. And when actions and narratives collide, someone has to be wrong. That tension is exactly why this debate won't die down. The media may still be debating whether Sanders looks the part, but the franchise appears more focused on whether he can grow into it with the right support. And history shows that when reality finally catches up, the narrative doesn't just shift, it flips. What makes this situation so interesting isn't what the Cleveland Browns are saying, it's what they're not saying. There's been no public declaration, no dramatic endorsement, no "this is our guy" press conference. Instead, the commitment is showing up in quieter, more revealing ways. And in the NFL, actions always speak louder than optimism. Start with how the organization is allocating its attention. The coaching search hasn't been about star power or splashy names, it's been about fit, offensive structure, developmental alignment. That alone signals belief. Teams don't reshape leadership unless they're trying to unlock something specific. And right now, everything points toward creating the right environment for Shedeur Sanders to take a real step forward. There's also what hasn't happened. Cleveland hasn't rushed to replace him. They haven't burned draft capital chasing the next shiny option. They haven't flooded the quarterback room with uncertainty. That restraint matters. In a league addicted to overcorrection, patience is a tell. It suggests internal confidence even if that confidence hasn't been made public yet. Reports claim the front office, led by Andrew Berry, is thinking beyond short-term noise. The focus appears to be on infrastructure, protection up front, reliable pass catchers, and a play caller who understands rhythm and timing. That's not the blueprint of a team hedging its bets. That's the blueprint of a team trying to see what it truly has before making irreversible decisions. This approach also reframes the stakes. If Sanders struggles after receiving structure, continuity, and support, then evaluation becomes fair. But judging him before those pieces are in place only guarantees confusion. Cleveland seems to understand that now, and that realization alone separates them from teams that cycle quarterbacks endlessly while blaming the position instead of the process. What's happening feels intentional, not reactive. The Browns aren't trying to win headlines in March, they're trying to win clarity by November, and clarity only comes when opportunity matches expectation. That's why this commitment matters. It's not loud enough to trend, but it's strong enough to shape a season. Sanders doesn't need protection from criticism. He needs alignment, and for the first time, Cleveland appears ready to offer it. If this quiet commitment holds, the conversation won't be about belief anymore. It'll be about results. And by then, the Browns won't have to explain their direction. It'll be obvious. At some point, every rebuild reaches a moment where hesitation turns into commitment. And whether the Cleveland Browns want to say it publicly or not, that moment feels closer than ever. Not because everything is settled, but because the organization has stopped hedging. The moves being made suggest belief, not panic, direction, not confusion. For a long time, the Browns lived in the space between decisions, too cautious to fully commit, too uncertain to fully reset. That middle ground is where franchises stall. What's different now is that the actions finally match a plan. Coaching interviews aligned with development, roster restraint instead of desperation, an off-season approach that looks more like preparation than damage control. This is where Shedeur Sanders becomes central to the story, not as a promise but as a test. Cleveland isn't guaranteeing outcomes, they're guaranteeing opportunity. And in the NFL, that distinction matters. Sanders isn't being protected from competition, but he's no longer being buried by it either. He's being given something quarterbacks rarely get early on, a fair evaluation window. That's what pushing the chips in actually looks like. It's not a headline move. It's trusting your infrastructure enough to stop chasing quick fixes. It's believing that clarity comes from commitment, not constant replacement. If Sanders succeeds, the Browns finally have continuity. If he struggles, they'll know it wasn't because the foundation was missing. There's also accountability baked into this moment, for the front office, for the coaching staff, for the narratives that have floated unchecked. When development is prioritized, excuses shrink, results become clearer, and that's exactly where Cleveland appears to be heading under Andrew Berry's watch. The media may still debate ceilings and labels, but the franchise seems focused on something simpler: progress. And progress doesn't care about draft slot or preseason narratives. It shows up on Sundays in reps stacked, in mistakes corrected, in confidence earned instead of declared. That's why this moment matters beyond one player or one season. It represents a shift in how Cleveland approaches the most important position in sports. No more half steps, no more constant resets, just a decision to see things through. If the chips are truly being pushed in, the Browns won't need to sell belief anymore. They'll let the season do it for them. And when that happens, this conclusion won't feel like optimism, it'll feel like the start of accountability turning into answers.